"You've humiliated me enough, mother-in-law." My daughter-in-law's words cut through the air like a sharp blade. There, in my own living room, in front of my children and grandchildren, she said this to me with a cold smile on her lips. My heart stopped for a few seconds. 43 years of marriage, 20 years of being her mother-in-law, and this is how she saw me. As someone who humiliated. I was always polite and respectful, and I never interfered in my son's life with her. On the contrary, I always tried to help, even when she insisted on ignoring me at family gatherings or muttered comments about my simplicity to her friends. I always swallowed hard when she corrected my grammar in front of others, or when she sighed every time I offered her my home-cooked meal, preferring to order something more sophisticated. "Grandma doesn't understand these modern things," she would tell my grandchildren, as if I were an outdated relic. For years, I endured the pitying looks from the other daughters-in-law in the family, the whispers about how I was too outdated to keep up with a cultured woman like her. I saw her roll her eyes when I talked about my youth, as if my story held no value. She would arrive at parties dressed in expensive clothes, talking about international travel, making a point of mentioning her master's degree, her language courses, always portraying me as the ignorant mother-in-law who knew nothing. But that day something changed. Maybe it was the way she said it, or the awkward silence that followed. My children lowered their eyes, embarrassed. My grandchildren stopped playing. And me, I simply smiled. A smile she couldn't decipher. Because in that moment, I realized the time had come for her to discover who I truly am. And believe me, the answer I'd kept hidden for so long would surprise her far more than she could have imagined. Sometimes, those you underestimate hold secrets that can change everything forever. That sentence echoed in my mind for days. You've already humiliated me enough. As if I, a 62-year-old woman, had spent 2 decades deliberately trying to belittle her. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. Because in fact, the exact opposite was true. I remember the first Christmas dinner she spent with us. I had set the table with my most beautiful china, the one my mother gave me when I got married. She looked at everything with that polite but icy smile and asked if I didn't have something more modern. When I served my vatapa, she made a subtle grimace and said she was trying to eat healthier. My husband tried to lighten the mood, but I saw the embarrassment in his eyes. It was always like that. Little nudges disguised as kindness. She'd arrive with expensive gifts for her children, emphasizing that she wanted to give them the best, as if what I offered wasn't enough. When I told stories of my youth, she'd change the subject or check her phone with a bored expression. To her, I was just the simple mother-in-law, uncultured, unrefined. What hurt most was seeing my son remain silent in these situations. He had grown up listening to my stories, who knew where we came from, who knew every sacrifice I made to give him an education. But in her presence, he seemed to forget all of that, as if he were ashamed of his own origins. Perhaps that's why so many people choose to stay here, following each revelation, because they know that behind every silence lies a story much more complex than meets the eye. And my story, well, it was just beginning to unfold at that moment when I decided to stop being silent. Because what she didn't know was that I'd been holding something back for 20 years. Something that would completely change the way she saw me. What I held wasn't a grudge. It was something far more powerful than that. It was knowledge. All these years, while she treated me like an ignorant woman, I watched her every move, every word, every little lie she told about herself. 20 years ago, when my son brought her home for the first time, she arrived in an elegant dress and with a forced accent. She said she'd studied in Europe and came from a traditional family in Sao Paulo. I smiled and waved, as I always did. But something bothered me. Maybe it was the way she held her fork, or the way she pronounced certain words when she was nervous. Small details that only a woman who raised children can recognize. For the first few years I tried to get closer. I asked about her family, about her studies abroad. Her answers were always vague and evasive. "Oh, you wouldn't know the place," she'd say with that condescending smile. When I persisted, she'd quickly change the subject, as if afraid to reveal something. It was on a Sunday afternoon 15 years ago that the first clue appeared. She had left her purse open on the kitchen table while playing with my grandson in the backyard. An old ID card slipped out. The name was correct, but the birthplace wasn't Sao Paulo. It was a small town in the interior of Bahia, the same region where I was born. That night I couldn't sleep. Why would she lie about this? Why would she hide her origins? And most importantly, why would she treat a woman who came from the same place as her with such contempt? I started paying more attention. At family dinners, when she talked about culture and sophistication, I'd sit quietly and watch. Because now I knew that behind that facade lay a very different truth. A truth she'd do anything to keep hidden. Discovering that wallet changed everything for me. Not because I judged her origins. On the contrary, I felt connected to her in a way I'd never felt before. We were two women who left the countryside of Bahia in search of a better life. The difference was that I never denied where I came from. Over the next few days, I began to notice other details. The way she recognized specific spices from our region when she thought no one was paying attention. The way her eyes would sparkle when I played Luis Gonzaga music, before she remembered to feign disinterest. And most importantly, how she knew exactly where the corner grocery store was in the town where I grew up, when I mentioned it in casual conversation. For months, I was torn between confronting her and simply letting it go. Part of me wanted to hug her and tell her there was no need to hide anything. That I understood her shame because I'd felt it too. When I arrived in Salvador at 17, with a cardboard suitcase and a thick accent, I was also judged. I also tried to adapt, to speak more beautifully, to dress differently. But the difference between us was stark. While I'd learned to accept my heritage with pride, she'd built a completely false persona. And worse, she used this lie to belittle me, to make me feel inferior for being exactly what she was, but couldn't admit. It is at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent signal that the message has touched them, because they recognize the pain of being judged by those who should understand them better. I could have revealed everything right then. He could have told the whole family that he knew the truth. But I chose silence, not out of fear or weakness, but because I was waiting for the right moment. The moment when she would surrender herself completely. And that moment came that afternoon, when she finally publicly humiliated me. That afternoon that changed everything began seemingly normally. It was my granddaughter's 15th birthday, and the whole family was gathered in the backyard. I had spent the entire morning preparing snacks, decorating the table, and organizing every detail with the care only a grandmother can muster. My granddaughter was radiant, running around, showing off her new dress to everyone. That's when my daughter-in-law arrived with a catering team. Yes, she had booked a full-service catering without telling me. I thought something more professional would be better, she said, as she directed the staff to replace my decorations with hers. In front of all the guests, she began removing my sweets from the table, placing them on a separate tray, as if they were second-rate food. I felt heat rise to my face. It wasn't anger. It was a mixture of humiliation and sadness that tore at my insides. My sister, who was at the party, looked at me with pity. My neighbors whispered to each other. And my son remained silent, pretending nothing was happening. But the turning point came when my granddaughter innocently asked, "Grandma, why did Mommy switch your sweets?" Then my daughter-in-law turned to me, with that cold smile I knew so well, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Because your grandma doesn't understand that not everything we make at home is good enough for a big party. Sometimes we need higher standards." The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if time had stopped. 20 years of petty humiliations had culminated in that moment. 20 years of being treated like a worthless, incompetent, unimportant woman. That's when I looked around and saw all those faces staring at me. Some with pity, others with embarrassment. And I decided it was time for her to find out who had really been humiliating whom all these years. In that instant, when my sweets were removed from the table and replaced by cold buffet platters, I felt as if I were standing before a distorted mirror. On one side, the image of the woman I had always been, simple, steadfast, molded by hands that never shied away from work. On the other, the caricature she was trying to construct of me, as if my existence could be reduced to an outdated prop. The contrast was cruel, and yet there was a strange revelation in it. I realized that the public humiliation wasn't limited to me. It splashed over the memory of those who came before me. The dignity of my mother who handed me my first wedding plate, the effort of each generation that transformed poverty into sustenance. When she discarded my dishes, it wasn't just the food she despised. It was the history that came with each recipe, each seasoning, each detail preserved as an invisible inheritance. And even as this pain coursed through me, something else rose silently within me. It was like a flickering flame in a dark room, small but stubborn, refusing to go out. Because I knew I had been harboring a truth for years that no one there suspected. And that truth, if revealed, would not only balance the scales, but reveal who was truly trapped in the lie. The voices around me sounded distant, as if I were submerged in water. I saw lips move, saw looks of discomfort, but the sound came muffled, almost unreal. It was in this inner silence that my mind drew the weight of that scene. I was no longer just the ignored mother-in-law, I was the family's blind spot, the detail everyone pretended not to see, but which sustained more than it seemed. Amidst fear and hope, I felt as if I were at an invisible crossroads. The fear of exposing too much, of breaking bonds that might still be salvageable. The hope that, when the time was right, the truth would have the power to illuminate the entire room at once. And it was in this duality that I remained, smiling on the outside, burning on the inside. No rush to respond, no rush to react. Just breathing in the moment like someone holding their breath before diving deep, knowing that the surface was no longer enough. Because what was about to emerge from that darkness wasn't just my voice. It was the revelation that would forever change the way everyone saw us. The silence that followed that humiliation didn't put an end to the party. On the contrary, it made every laugh sound more forced, every conversation more uncomfortable. I noticed the averted glances, the fidgety hands, the suppressed whispers. The scene had already etched itself in the memory of everyone present, and it was precisely this weight that I let hang in the air. The impact wasn't just in her words, but in the collective reaction, in the way the room seemed smaller after she decided to expose me. It was then that I understood that certain battles don't require an immediate response. Her action had already created the reaction I needed. I didn't need to raise my voice for the truth to begin to move. I just had to watch how the pieces on the board rearranged themselves. The guests looked at me for a reaction, but I offered only a calm smile. That silence was more eloquent than any defense I could offer. And little by little, I realized the concrete consequences of this restrained gesture. My granddaughter, still confused, stayed close to me for the rest of the afternoon, as if to protect me from discomfort. My neighbors, who had previously whispered with pity, now looked at me with respect. Even my son, silent as always, couldn't hide the shame on his face. The strategy of belittling me in public had had the opposite effect. It exposed her arrogance. This contrast between effort and reward always intrigued me. She tried so hard to erase me, but the harder she tried, the more evident the shadow she cast of herself became. It was as if each attack was a test, and with each test I discovered a new way to resist. What to her seemed like an immediate victory, to me was proof that the truth was quietly ripening, waiting for its moment to fall on its own. And perhaps you've experienced something similar too, when someone tries to belittle your story in front of witnesses. Often, this is where the greatest insights emerge, the ones that make us reflect on the value of remaining steadfast, even in silence. If this thought has crossed your mind, share it with me. How would you transform humiliation into strength? The tension that began that day didn't end with the party. Instead, it spread like a slowly smoldering ember, paving the way for something bigger. I knew there would be more, and with each passing moment the anticipation grew, like the sound of distant thunder announcing a storm no one could avoid. That night, after everyone had left, the house remained heavy with the echo of the party. The stainless steel trays still gleamed on the table, cold, soulless, replacing the sweets I'd prepared with my own hands. The contrast was so stark it almost seemed symbolic. On one side, the purchased pomp. On the other, the discarded affection. I walked through the remains of the event like someone crossing a silent battlefield, realizing that the real war had not been fought in front of the guests, but within each eye that witnessed the scene. The consequences of her choice didn't remain confined to that backyard. The next day, I could already sense the change in the air. A neighbor who had always been distant stopped me at the gate, asking if I was okay with unusual gentleness. Another, who witnessed the embarrassment, commented that she couldn't remember seeing a woman so serene in the face of such an affront. These small gestures were like fragments of an invisible web forming around me, a web that she, despite all her efforts, could never control. And yet, there was the shadow of defiance. Because behind every expression of support, I knew there was also curiosity, the silent question. How long would I remain silent? This doubt lingered not only in others, but in myself. The serenity I displayed was not an absence of pain. It was a carefully woven cloak to hide the flame that burned within. As I cleared away the dishes, I wondered how she must have felt. Did she believe she'd won? Did she sleep peacefully, convinced that the party had erased any trace of my worth? This uncertainty didn't bother me. On the contrary, it fueled the certainty that patience is often the most lethal weapon. Because the rush to humiliate reveals more about the aggressor than the victim. The growth of my strength stemmed precisely from this contrast. The more she tried to diminish me, the more I realized the grandeur of standing tall amidst the gale. It wasn't blind pride, it was conscious resistance, like a tree bending before the wind only to prove its roots are intact. And so I went to sleep that night, my heart torn between hope and doubt. Hope that the truth would find its way to the surface. Uncertainty about the price of revealing it. But one thing was certain: the silence wouldn't last forever. Something was about to move, and when it did, no words could undo the impact. The silence that night wasn't just the absence of voices, but a weight that settled in every corner of the house. The walls seemed to hold echoes of what had happened, as if they had witnessed something too great to forget. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. The dark ceiling above me felt like a heavy veil, and I wondered if the world around me also saw what I now saw so clearly: that the party hadn't just been a birthday, but the stage for a much deeper game. The images came back in vivid detail. My granddaughter staring confusedly at the candy being removed, the neighbor's embarrassed expressions, my son's awkward silence. All of this played out in my memory as if they were photographs taken at the exact moment each person chose their side. And perhaps that was the most painful part, realizing that not everyone would come to my defense. Some would prefer to remain in the shadows, out of fear or convenience. This realization brought me a strange mix of confidence and doubt. Confidence because I knew the truth was with me. Doubt because I understood that truth alone isn't always enough to change the perception of those who don't want to see. It was like walking down a long corridor, illuminated by small slivers of light, but with entire stretches plunged into shadow. I had to decide where to step, unsure which part of the floor would support my weight. Still, there was something transformative about this process. I discovered that public humiliation, instead of breaking me, began to shape me differently. I was no longer just the woman who endured in silence. I became the woman who chose when and how to speak out. This change was subtle, almost invisible, but as real as the blood pulsing through my veins. And that early morning, listening to the distant sound of a dog barking on the deserted street, I realized I was getting closer and closer to the point where the silence would become unbearable. Something inside me was rising like a tide about to break onto the beach. I knew that when that wave came, nothing would stay the same. The challenge was no longer whether I would speak, but when, and what the price of that inevitable moment would be. The next morning, as the light filtered through the curtains and traced golden streaks across the living room floor, I realized something inside me was no longer the same. There was no longer room for the weight that had once paralyzed me. The humiliation, which could have been my downfall, had become fuel. It was as if every averted glance, every whispered comment, had pushed me to the point of no return. I was no longer just the woman who endured. I had become the woman who chose how to transform pain into strength. The contrast was before my eyes. On one hand, the constant challenge of living under the judgment of those who thrived on appearances. On the other, the silent conquest of knowing that I carry within me something no one can take from me. My truth, my story, my origin. And it was in this delicate balance between fragility and strength that I found the key to rising above. I remembered the party as if it were a scene shot on old film. The sweets removed from the table, my granddaughter's confused eyes, the heavy silence that spread among the guests. But now, when I revisit that image, I no longer feel pain. Feel clarity, because every gesture of contempt became proof of what was always there for all to see. The one who really needed to hide wasn't me. This learning process wasn't easy. It was hard, cutting, and required me to endure entire nights of self-doubt. But at the same time, it brought the surprise of discovering that I'm still capable of reinventing myself, even at 62. It's this sense of rebirth that I want to leave engraved, because I know it's not just mine. Many who follow my story recognize themselves in this silent struggle, and perhaps that's why so many feel the urge to leave their presence here, liking, commenting, and subscribing, as a gesture that we're not alone on this journey. Today, looking back, I don't just see the pain. I also see the privilege of having come this far without losing myself. Because being underestimated was never the end. It was just the beginning of the revelation. And it's this revelation that remains, like a whisper strong enough to cross time. When they try to erase who you are, it's precisely in that moment that you learn to shine even brighter.